first of all, I'm really happy to be here, so thank you. I'm really happy to be back at Kitzel's Cabin. And I say back because the last time I was here was probably about 15, 16 years ago. And if you open up this lovely little booklet here that was provided, there is a photo somewhere in the middle of that viewing platform. And the last time I was here, I was down at the water beneath that viewing platform with a group of friends, and we crawled and climbed up to the top. So I'm quite happy to be back. I was a much younger, dumber, and inconsiderate Andy Klimach at that time. Yeah, so as Quinn mentioned, I'm representing Klimach College, and also I am the treasurer on the board of directors for the Museum of Northern BC in Prince Rupert. I've been on the board of directors for the Keynote Museum Archives as well. So, and also with the Jasper Yellowhead Museum, following my time as manager. We're going to talk a bit about art and its meaning and people and history and connections. And if there's something that I'm maybe not speaking to that I should, please feel free to raise your hand and say, hey, what about this? That's totally fine. But yeah, the title is Storytelling Through Bronze, Creating Cooking. And that is what the sculpture ended up looking like. And it took just under 2 years, or just over 2 years rather, to create, from the beginning processes of brainstorming to that final product of bronze. And we're going to talk a little bit about Jasper National Park, because you can't have a conversation about the sculpture without the background on why it was created. So Jasper National Park was originally not a park. It was originally territories that some 20 different indigenous groups had some sort of claim to or history with. Currently, the northern portion of Jasper National Park is covered by Treaty 8 and the southern portion by Treaty 6. But you'll see there's a photo of a totem pole, and that is currently the Two Brothers pole. It replaced the Raven totem pole, which came from Haida Gwaii around the turn of the 20th century. And around the same time, Jasper National Park, Parks Canada, the government of Canada, was putting kind of their foot down, spreading their muscles and saying, no, we're going to be here. All you Indigenous First Nations groups, we'll just kind of push you out. Meanwhile, let's essentially steal this totem pole from Haida Gwaii, put it on the train, ship it over, and raise it in a place where there's no reason for a totem pole to be. And as the Raven totem pole aged, because it was erected around 1910 or so, Jasper was created in 1907, but as that totem pole aged and became dangerous, they thought, well, maybe we should take this down. And then there were conversations with the Haida people to have it returned, where it was returned, and it's now sitting in Masset, Old Masset, under the care of the Haida people there. But there was also concern, well, we need to do something to replace this pole. So the Two Brothers pole was created, and it was raised in Jasper, I think in about 2006. But if you're a Cree person who's suddenly, your traditional territory isn't your traditional territory anymore, and you see a Haida totem pole there, and you're thinking, well, what about us? What about the other 19 groups, First Nations groups, Indigenous groups, who have some sort of connection to what's Jasper National Park? What about their representation? What about their recognition? What about their ability to be on their traditional territory as the original keepers of that territory? And that's where I come in. So I've told you a little bit about the backstory. One of the groups is the Aseniwuche Winewak Nation, and that's a Cree name for Rocky Mountain people. And I'll say it again, Aseniwuche Winewak. And they were essentially forced out in, again, around 1907 to what's now the Grand Cache area, and they were told, you can settle here. We don't want you here. And so they set up there. They are not under treaty. There's a few different settlements around Grand Cache, which make their home. And, you know, a few decades go by, and I think if you're a displaced group of people that's suddenly not connected to what's your homeland, that lingers, that festers. And as things change politically and socially, people say, no, 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 this is ours, this is our connection. We want to have something meaningful, authentic back to Jasper National Park. And that's what the Aseniwuche Winewak Nation was saying to Parks Canada. And they've been saying that for a while. And it had become a bit of a sore spot. So when I became manager of the Jasper Yellowhead Museum and Archives in 2014, Parks Canada came over and said, we need to do something. And I said, yes, we do. And they wanted to originally say, okay, let's do something where there's a display inside the building that features something around hunting, gathering, those traditional aspects. It's like, yeah. But they also said, well, let's do something also that speaks to people passing by on the street, something public. Oh, and the budget's only $5,000. You can't do a whole lot if you want to make a public art piece with $5,000 and an indoor display. So we got thinking, we got talking, we got moving in a direction where we didn't want anything First Nations in Jasper just to be represented by totem poles. And I have nothing against totem poles. I think they're beautiful, I think they're amazing, and I think there's a lot of power in them. But they're not supposed to be in an area where the local First Nations have no connection to them. And Parks Canada agreed. So we had a small budget. We had, and in Jasper, people who became very used to being known for a place with totem poles. Both that large one by the train station, followed by the two brothers. But then there were also local businesses and hotels and things like that that would also set up their own little totem poles that were made in China. And that wasn't really good either. So the in-kind contribution for the museum was that I would take on this project and make it happen with working with Parks Canada and the Aseniwuche Winewak Nation, one of those 20-ish groups who had claim to the park area. And our $5,000 budget very quickly turned into over $30,000 because a lot of people got interested and excited to say, hey, how can we contribute to this? How can we make it happen? Because it was long overdue. And while most people expressed support, not everyone was always on board or could see the importance of the project. One individual associated with the museum at the time, board of director, he asked, do we really want this? Do we really want this place to turn into an Indian museum? What? This was 2015. Exact words. And then another community member asked, we have the totem pole. Why do we need more native stuff? This is in Jasper National Park. And has everybody in the room been there at some point or another? Yeah. And then, little did anyone know, but a massive shift in Indigenous representation in Jasper was about to happen. And I think you know the analogy of an avalanche. You get a couple of rocks tumbling down the hill and it creates more movement and motion, and things change, and they change rapidly. That brings us to nothing about us without us. The project was elder-led. There were multiple conversations, meetings, and an elder visit to the museum site. And that happened in May 2015. But I remember being in this boardroom with the Aseniwuche Winewak leadership and elders, and we're sitting around this table, all these elders, and they're all speaking in Cree back and forth, saying, this is what we want, this is what we're looking for. And the president of the time of the Aseniwuche Winewak Nation was interpreting and saying, okay, yes, this, that. But it was all elder-led. And then I would take all that information back to Parks Canada and say, this is what they want. And Parks Canada was like, yeah, let's do it. Sure enough, the proposal in writing took like 16 variations to go back and forth from Jasper to Ottawa back, but they were on board. They were super supportive, great to work with, as was the Aseniwuche Winewak Nation. I can talk about it now. I was really upset at the time. But there were things, I don't know how much I want to get into this part, but I was leading this project. It was nearing completion, but there was also a whole lot of other things going on behind the scenes, between the board, between staff, me, and my mindset at the time. I really wanted to see this project happen. I was dealing with a board and staff who wanted things to change. But many of them did not want to change. And, between trying to coordinate this, run the facility, keep staff happy, do different things in the community, it was like, well, no, Andy, you take your weekend and go sell more hot dogs. We need to make more money. We need to do more fundraising. We all know about this, the pressures of fundraising, of meeting budgets, of staying open, of paying our staff. There were so many months where I was looking at the numbers thinking, okay, either we make payroll or I fix something. And I think most of us know what that's like. Do I do this or do I do that? And there was a level of dysfunction in the organization at the time, which was not easy to deal with. And I probably contributed to that dysfunction at times as well. But I departed the museum on April 27th, 2016, so just under 10 years ago, with the sculpture not being yet complete or ready to install. I felt the project was suddenly in jeopardy because there was people also within the staff who did not see its value. And their voices were suddenly being heard a lot more. But on September 15th, 2016, the sculpture did get installed. The one person who really didn't want it to happen on staff phoned me up and said, oh, it's happening today, can you help dig? I'm like, well, I was fired. Sure, I'll be there, I'll help. Free labor. And it got put up. And then the sculpture Cookham was officially unveiled on June 23rd, 2017. And I was not present because I wasn't invited until about 3 days before. And that was a real hit. Sometimes you lose people, sometimes things happen like that. But if there's somebody who's involved in something, who's really putting their heart and soul into it, invite them, let them know. And either way, the story was being told, the story was being viewed. Most importantly, the story and its meaning could not be taken away from the descendants of the people who had been forced to leave so long ago. I feel honored to have been part of the journey, and I learned a lot about myself in the process too. The sculpture is made in the likeness of a matriarch named Lucy Winewak. She's long since passed. In real life, she was about 4 feet tall, and that's what the sculpture is. It's a 4 feet tall sculpture. And in the summer of 2020, I rejoined the Jasper Yellowhead Historical Society, the group that runs the museum. I was a member of the board of directors, and it was easy to do so remotely during the pandemic, because I wanted people to be involved. And this time on the board, I served as a valuable member. I connected. There was a lot of growth since my departure previously, and I was able to kind of continue with some of the work around this project. Because there was one thing that didn't happen when the sculpture was originally put up. We had no interpretive panels with it. So people would be walking by the sculpture and there was literally no information to go with it. So that doesn't tell a story very well. So I worked with some other board members. I worked with some of the same people who I had originally worked with at the outset of the project to create interpretive panel. And you can see it here. It tells the story of Lucy and the Andy. It tells it in Cree syllabics, in English, in Cree, regular, and then in French. And so it speaks to her as the grandmother, because that's the Cree word for grandmother. And she was a woman who all the different little Aseniwuche Winewak communities in Grand Cache felt some connection to. They valued her. She picked berries, she was very knowledgeable, she spoke fluent Cree, she never really learned much English. Incredible woman. And that's the story they wanted to tell. Because she had that connection to the place. And she had a connection to all of them, not just as some past figure, but as a future one as well. Making change. If you go to Jasper now, there's another kind of sculpture. There's the Indigenous exhibit, which is up. It's kind of right across from the Two Brothers totem pole, right in front of, well, actually kind of to the northeast of the big visitor center. And this Indigenous exhibit, I'll get to the photo in a moment, but it contains information for virtually all of the other First Nations groups, Indigenous groups that have claimed to what's now Jasper National Park. It's a really powerful, moving thing. It was a decade in the making. So you have the sculpture at the museum, you have this downtown, kind of front and center. Things are changing. And that's what it looks like. That's one part of it. That's like the main centerpiece. It's kind of in an amphitheater style. But what's more is there's been some real grassroots development as well in town with people saying, hey, we need to do more. And this is just coming organically from people in town. Like, let's create these murals that are First Nations themed, have really cool depictions of different things. So you see that in Jasper. And you see that in the last decade, a lot has happened. Because I grew up going, I'm 43, and I've been going through Jasper since I was a wee little child. And there was virtually nothing for years and years and years except the Torrent Hills. Now if you go, you're going to see a whole lot more First Nations content that accurately, meaningfully represents the people with connections there. And I think as museums, I think as historical societies, I think that's our job, is to make those connections for people. And doing so by public art is one way to do it. So yeah, this project may seem small, insignificant, but there's steps for Indigenous reconciliation, representation that are meaningful and authentic. And I think they're not. And my advice, if I can say so, is sometimes we as museums need to be a little more bold. We need to take those steps to make things happen, to make those changes. And of course we need to work with our local First Nations groups. Again, nothing without us, or nothing about us without us. They take the lead. There's money out there to make things happen. And I know that's hard to say when there's so many other competing interests. to keep the lights on and things like that. But it matters. And these kind of projects, they tell the story of the past, the present, and the future while displaying to Canadians and the whole world who Canada's original inhabitants were, and their treatment and the current status of what things are like now, even since Confederation. And moreover, and most importantly, public memory initiatives have the potential to be empowering while serving to bring Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples together through collaboration and relationship building. We need more of that. We need way more of that in this country. It shouldn't be this group over here, that group over there, never talking to each other. What I set out to do behind this project was to get people talking to each other, to get those shared experiences, to get those shared connections, to get that shared value. And I think that happens through art, and I think that happens through museums. So sometimes to look at the present is to look at the past with new hope and appreciation. And I hope I spoke to what I was going to fairly well. And I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you. The only thing outside, well, there's a number of different things outside, but the sculpture has kind of become, it's getting featured more in like social media and in kind of pop culture. Like right before Christmas, the museum made this AI-generated video where Cookham suddenly comes to life and starts walking around the museum and goes inside to the gift shop. Like, it's become more a feature of the community too. And I think it's become valued, along with, I think, Indigenous representation in general, because that was lacking before. It was. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I just had a question about the museum's role in providing visitors and locals with that story of displacement and stealing of land by Parks Canada. Like, how do you navigate that tale when you're on essentially Parks Canada own land? Like, how do you tell the truth and like?
That's a good question. And there's a couple of pieces, because I think Parks Canada was incredibly eager to do that storytelling and to do that piece of like, yeah, we're always the best people in this regard, and this is what we're trying to do about it. The biggest obstacle was actually from the museum itself. And even when, because I was on the board when the discovery at the Kamloops site happened. And I remember watching on social media, on Facebook, all these different museums across Alberta, across Canada, were like putting out posts or statements about that discovery. And I was working at a First Nations university at the time that was a former residential school. So everybody was quite heightened. And I remember sending an email to the other board members and stuff, like, why haven't you sent anything out? And this is Jasper. And they said, well, we didn't have a residential school here. I was like, that doesn't matter. It does. It obviously matters. But the fact that you don't think it's necessary to send out a statement on such a big, is kind of telling. And there have been some changes with that too. But Parks was awesome. The Aseniwuche Winewak Nation was awesome. They still are. Museum still has a little bit of work to do itself. But the fact that I was called back to help with the interpretive panel being developed, that was cool. So, yeah.
Just,
oh,
sorry, no, please.
okay.
I was just wondering what the decision process was to partner specifically with the Aseniwuche Winewak Nation instead of any of the other 20 nations.
Good question. And the fact is, they were and there's quite a bit there. So I'm going to try and, there's a Jasper Indigenous Forum, which includes everybody, okay? And their main focus at the time was having that big Indigenous exhibit that represented everybody. But the Aseniwuche Winewak Nation was the group that was more, I don't want to say more, but their story of their exodus was more obvious. And they wanted to be, they've never asked for compensation, they've never asked for anything other than, hey, we just want specific representation of this group to this site. And that was kind of the reasoning behind that, if that makes sense.
So did you reach out to them, or did
No.
they reach out to you?
No. I was on the job less than 2 months before Parks Canada and the Aseniwuche Winewak came over and said, hey, we want to do this. And the only reason that happened was because there was a change in leadership at the museum. Okay, great. Oh, and then I'll get back to you. So, yeah.
You said there was a change of leadership. Did that change of leadership inspire Parks and the Nation to come forward?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because the previous manager, but there's a lot here, and I don't want to get too, but
Totally,
the previous manager was not super supportive of anything Indigenous or First Nations related. And she'd been in that role for quite a while. And then my departure put her back in charge, which is why I suddenly felt very anxious for the project to be completed. And there is a bat or something.
Oh,
That's
it's
okay.
bird.
Yeah.
Oh, bye.
Welcome to Kids with Companions. Okay, and yeah, it won't hurt anybody, but yeah. Back to you.
I'm just thinking, I mean, the last time I was in Jasper was like, it was pre-COVID, but I mean, I loved it. cultural appropriation,
Yeah.
right, as you say the term, but also like in gift shops, like the capitalization of
Mhm.
a different nation's culture in Jasper. Did you ever like consciously think as a museum or as a board, like what is our role in education or moving that mindset forward? I mean, how do you
Yeah.
battle that? Because if you're a museum and you're talking about the people that actually live there, and the community is talking about like the hideout or demonstrating this, material culture from, like that's just complete. How do you deal with that?
You're touching on something very significant, and sometimes I think I get in trouble because I push back, and that's exactly what happened.
Well, good.
Yeah,
Bravo.
and that's part of the reason I was fired, was because I was saying to these people, like, no, you have a totem pole made in China outside your hotel. What's with that? People don't like to be, I'll leave it there.
Fair.
But yeah, absolutely, that was a huge part of the conversation and the thinking. And I don't know how much time I have left, but
You're good.
okay, just wait.
If there's any more questions?
No.
No, you're good.
Any other questions or insights, or like, what do you mean?
You said like relationships improved because of the project. Do you think that was just like between you personally, or would you say that the nation and like BC Parks have a much better relationship?
All around. Yeah, all around. When we were making the panel, we were working very closely with knowledge keepers and language keepers who would be very specific on the spelling, and especially the Cree text, because there's not a lot of fluent Cree speakers left, like most Indigenous languages. There's not a lot of people who hold that, and Cree has something like 4 or 5 different dialects. So what was spoken in St. Paul, that area, versus what is spoken up north can be quite different. There's different spellings, there's different expressions, there's words I would use with elders in St. Paul that elders up north in, say, high level, they'd be like, what are you saying? And same thing if you go towards the west in the mountains. So yeah, but you make an effort, the elders lead, and that's where it starts. Yeah, Quinn?
You mentioned that the elders were leading the project. What was kind of the museum and Parks Canada's role in the project following their lead?
To get the money together and to identify a timeline and a work plan to make it happen. That was basically our role. And then to make sure it was communicated to the public as often as possible what was happening and when and why. And that was more of my job too.
Did the museum board have a hard time with not kind of taking over the project or making executive decisions?
They wanted kind of as little to do with it as possible.
Okay.
The only thing they were worried about was if it was going to cost money.
Right.
Which it wasn't, because it was all provided. So again, I think being bold, being open, being about, hey, how do we make this change happen? And it's easier said than done, I get that. But yeah, the board was stable. And it was also, like, we had a gift shop manager whose dad was on the board, and they had a conflict of interest there. So when she departed, he departed, drama. So, I've been on 3 different museum boards. I think it's also super important for clarity of roles, of responsibilities, of communication, to make things happen, to make your places a success. Yeah.
I just want to say thank you for sharing the story because it's, I would imagine, very full of emotion and and to share a story that's full of like warts and all is like tremendous. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Great.
I'm gonna peace out back over there, but feel free to chat later.
So now we'll just take another little 15-minute break to reflect, get more coffee, or, yeah.